Well, thank you very much. And on behalf of the NEH, I'd like to express particular appreciation for the History Channel, especially Dr. Libby O'Connell, CNN, and then, of course, the National Trust for the Humanities, our host today, this venerable institution that is part of the Smithsonian called the National Museum of American History. It's really a privilege on behalf of a government agency to recognize Howard University, one of the really preeminent American universities, for all the effort it has put into today's endeavors. And so we feel very privileged that Howard is working with us. We're gathered on a historic day. As Dr. Ayers will tell you in a moment, this is the precise anniversary of the Battle of Antietam, where more Americans lost their lives than in any day in history, the bloodiest day in our long history. The President of the United States at the time, we all recognize, was a man named Abraham Lincoln. And he wrote something today which will be much discussed, which is basically a promise. In two senses, a promise of our founders and a promise he made to come forth some 100+ days later with the fulfillment of that promise, a proclamation on emancipation. Emancipation is singularly important in our history, and what Lincoln in effect did was he allowed the promise of our times be applied to all American citizens.
Hello everyone, I'm Ed Ayers from the University of Richmond, and welcome to today's program at the Smithsonian Institution, co-sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Over the next hour, we're going to explore a time when the future of the nation and the future of slavery would be forever changed. Now, although we're talking about the past, this is a very 21st century kind of discussion today. We're ranging across the country online with over 100 watch parties in 32 states and 2 countries abroad, bringing together in a virtual network thousands of students of all different kinds of backgrounds. We hope that you'll be sending us some questions and continue the conversation on your own. In addition, we have a live audience today from schools and colleges and universities from Virginia, the District of Columbia, and Maryland, who have joined us in our discussion, and we're delighted to have them with us. We're also delighted that C-SPAN is broadcasting us today. Now, these ambitious conversations are being sponsored by the History Channel. They're hosting also an impressive event this afternoon at the Lincoln Memorial, and we'll broadcast our conversation later, as well as making it available on their website. To help offer inspiration, we have featured today the inkwell used by President Lincoln to write the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. He would visit the desk of the Superintendent of Military Telegraphs for the Army of the Potomac during his daily visit to the telegraph office, and there, in those few moments of peace, would use this brass inkwell to compose his thoughts, often penning only a sentence or two during the span of several weeks. Thanks to the Smithsonian for sharing this remarkable artifact with us. I'm fortunate today to be joined by my fellow historians, Christy Coleman of the American Civil War Center, Eric Foner of Columbia University, Gary Gallagher of the University of Virginia, and Thavolia Glymph of Duke University. You have their impressive biographical information in your program. Suffice it to say, they all really know what they're talking about. Now, I've asked our historians to begin our conversation today by focusing on what Americans could actually know about events and trends in early September 1862. So as tempting as it is, in other words, we're going to avoid looking ahead until we've set the scene. So I'll begin with Gary Gallagher. Tell us about the state of the war on this day, or this early September of 1862, Gary.
You mean the military side of the war?
I do mean the military side.
Well, I think that there are 2 important themes that would have been evident to anyone assessing the war in early September 1862, and that one is that the war had expanded vastly since the year before. Twice in the first 8 months of 1862, more Americans had been shot in one battle that had been shot in all the wars of America from the founding until 1862, Shiloh and the 7 Days. The other theme I think that would be evident is that there had been huge swings of morale and huge swings of momentum For the first 6 months of 1862, it seemed that the United States was pushing inexorably toward victory. A tremendous array of victories in the Western Theater, that area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, that had given control of New Orleans, the largest city of the Confederacy, to the United States, had closed the Mississippi River. Nashville had fallen, much of Tennessee already under United States control, Memphis gone. It seemed that the United States was on the verge of victory in the West, and the largest army of the Republic, the Army of the Potomac, was within 5 miles of Richmond. But in late June and early July, there was a striking turnaround when George B. McClellan's Union Army was defeated in the Battle of the 7 Days at Richmond. And then it seemed that the Confederates gained their stride and were pushing toward victory on their own. And here in early September, it seems that they've come close to achieving a significant array of victories. There's a Confederate army in Kentucky, there's a major Confederate army in Maryland, and it seems in the wake of his victories at the 7 Days and at Second Bull Run in late August, Robert E. Lee has managed to convince many people, not only in the Confederacy and the United States, but also in London and Paris, that in fact, all of that great hope that the United States had in the first 6 months of the war was coming to nothing, and the Confederacy might be close to achieving a military victory.
It sounds pretty alarming. It sounds as if it's not clear at all that people know how the Civil War is going to turn out.
Not clear.
At the beginning of 1862. Thavolia, can you tell us something about some of the situations that the enslaved people are facing across the South?
Okay, I think it's really important to, when we think about September 17th as the date of the preliminary proclamation, to consider that black people had by now had 17 months to make their own preliminary assessment of what this war was about, where they fit in, and that they had already decided by the time Lincoln put his pen to paper that they were important, that they were political actors, that they had a part to play in this role, in this war. And so over the course of those 17 months, by ones and twos and gradually in larger and larger groups, everywhere the Union Army appeared, black people appeared, or the enslaved appeared. And by the time Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, of course, Congress has acted in numerous ways. The first Confiscation Act, the second Confiscation Act, the Militia Act, the Article of War, the additional Article of War of 1862. So as Gary talks about or mentioned, the important battles that are taking place, what we have to do is connect those battles to black people's responses to those battles. So when New Orleans falls in 1862, what that means for slaves is that there's a place for them to go. There's a place for them to seek refuge within Union lines. At least this is what they believe. But of course, initially, Union soldiers and Union commanders say, no, you have no place. This war is not about you. This war is for Union, not freedom. But the slaves persist over the course of these many months, a year and a half about. And so I think as we situate this document, we have to keep in mind that it wasn't just Lincoln finally deciding now is the time, we've got a military victory of sorts at Antietam. God said that if we won, I could do this or should do this. That Lincoln is also responding to 17 months of abrasion and friction that the slaves have put on the table, brought to his door, in fact. And all of the temporizing, all of the temporizing that had to do with, well, we will, Lincoln to the border states, if you emancipate the slaves, we can do it gradually, then we can send them to Africa or Haiti or someplace else. All of that came to naught as, or in part because the slaves were so insistent that this war was not going to end in their enslavement and was not going to end in their colonization. Although, as Gary points out, everything is still up in the air.
That's our theme for the first half of our discussion. Everything is up in the air. So Christy, tell us about what this situation looks like to the abolitionists, black and white, in the North.
Absolutely. Well, you know, the abolitionists are certainly regarded as the radicals of the Republican Party, and they are adamant that emancipation has to happen. And they're pushing very, very hard. William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, of course, are the two who are perhaps the most radicalized, barring John Brown, of course. But they are really trying their best to get the party to eliminate these other ideas of, as T stated, they're trying to get them to abandon this idea of compensating. Why would you compensate? This is about the heart and the soul, the moral center of the nation. And if we're going to be a land of the free, then that's exactly what we need to be. We don't need to negotiate with anybody about that. So you've got that aspect of it. But we have to remember as well that among the abolitionist community, there is another group that tends to be, I don't want to use the term moderate, but they tend to be more moderate or more compromising to a certain degree. And these are the folks who are saying, well, yes, we want emancipation, we want to end slavery, we don't want it to expand anywhere, but the truth of the matter is we really don't want free black people running around. And so they themselves start offering a variety of ideas, and some of those, of course, was, you know, colonization. Other aspects of it were, you know, wherever you could remove these folks. But the idea of providing citizenship, the idea of expanding voting rights, that for that group of abolitionists, this is not what they want to see. They want to end slavery, but that doesn't mean that they want equal rights and equal access to these newly freed people. So I think it becomes important to realize that Northern sentiment or abolitionist sentiment itself is on a continuum. And these folks are evolving significantly along that line as the war is playing out.
So this just gets more and more complicated. I'm glad that Eric is going to explain how Abraham Lincoln was able to synthesize all this into a seamless solution to all of this.
Well, Lincoln once said that he could not remember a time that he did not hate slavery, and there's no reason to doubt that. Lincoln certainly was an anti-slavery man. He was not an abolitionist, but he had risen to prominence in the 1850s as the spokesman of the new Republican Party, dedicated to stopping the westward expansion of slavery and putting the institution on what he called the road to ultimate extinction, but that might be very far in the future. But from early in the Civil War, Lincoln put forward ideas about emancipation. We should not view Lincoln as being simply reluctant or simply being pushed by others, although of course he is. In late 1861, he put a plan to Delaware, one of the 4 slave states that remained in the Union. In early 1862, he was pressing this plan for the whole border states, the 4 slave states in the Union. Lincoln's plan basically was, we've heard a couple of elements of it, gradual emancipation, that is, these states should start the process, compensation, the owners would receive money because after all, slaves are property and they are going to be losing a property right, and colonization. That is, Lincoln at this point insisted that it would be better for both black and white for, as he said, the 2 races to be separated. Blacks, as free, should maybe be encouraged to go to Central America, Africa, something like that. But as the summer of 1862 rolls along, and you heard the military situation, you heard the, what's happening on the plantations, the abolitionist pressure, Lincoln comes to feel that a new approach is necessary. And in September 1862, it was already being reported in the newspapers that Lincoln had told his cabinet in July that he planned to adopt a new policy, which would be simply freeing the slaves in rebellious areas. And that was not yet public at this moment, but there were rumors of it floating around. If you were reading the New York Tribune, you would know that this had happened. So in the summer of '62, with the war not at a sort of a stalemate, and with this political pressure on him rising, Lincoln has decided that he's going to adopt a new approach which will lead to declaring free most of the slaves of the South.
And yet, he has not issued this document, which brings us back to our unfolding story, which I will hand back to Gary to tell us, how is it then that events lead up to Lincoln deciding this is the right time?
Well, as Thavolia said, it's always important to keep in mind the ways in which the military sphere and the non-military sphere intersected and influenced one another during the Civil War. And military events played absolutely critical roles twice relating to emancipation between the early summer and the early autumn of 1862. In the first instance, George B. McClellan's defeat at the Battle of the 7 Days prompted Congress to push forward with its Second Confiscation Act, which included an element that declared all the slaves of rebel owners in the Confederate States free. But it also prompted Lincoln to talk to his cabinet about the possibility of issuing a preliminary proclamation of emancipation. It's that battle, it's that defeat for United States military forces that persuades, in other words, both members of Congress and Lincoln that the war is going to last longer, that it's going to become more all-encompassing, and that it's going to take a much more strident approach on the part of the United States to subdue this rebel insurrection. And emancipation is a key part of that, because everyone understands in the Confederacy and the United States that without enslaved labor, there's no way the Confederacy could mobilize its white manpower to the degree it did and maintain this resistance in the face of more powerful United States armies.
So what you're saying, Gary, is in some ways the movement toward emancipation grows out of failure of the United States Army.
It absolutely does, yes. And then once Lincoln decides to do it, he waits for a moment that doesn't look like such failure to announce the proclamation.
And something like that happened exactly 150 years ago today. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, it happened at the Battle of Antietam, which is the culmination of what is a very long military operation in 3 acts. Act 1 is the 7 Days, where McClellan retreats from Richmond. Act 2 is the Second Battle of Bull Run, where the war is reoriented north toward the Potomac, and Act 3 is where the rebel army moves into the United States and fights a climactic battle of this long campaign in western Maryland, just across the Potomac River, the Battle of Antietam, which lasted 1 day, very bloody. Lee's army retreated after that. McClellan didn't pursue him, but Lee did retreat, and that was enough of a victory for Lincoln to move.
And you might also, Antietam, as well as being such a bloody battle, also illustrates what Gary was saying about the constant interconnection of political, military, and other kinds of considerations here. After all, why does Lee invade Maryland at all? The South is not trying to conquer the United States. They're trying to secede. They don't need to be in Maryland. But I think part of his consideration was to influence the coming fall elections in the North. There were these congressional elections coming up, and if Lee could win a battle on Union soil, that he felt that would really undermine Northern morale, maybe lead to a repudiation of the Lincoln administration, and maybe peace at that basis. So a military victory would have strong political implications as well.
That would be peace without emancipation at that stage.
Right.
If I could, you know, one of the things that, as we're trying to put together and connect these pieces, that I don't want the point to be lost, is that there is the self-agency that enslaved people are participating in this war early on, this decision to follow these armies, to join these armies. The Union Army themselves and those commanding officers that are willing to take African Americans into their units is significant, because now this labor as well as these forces of men are able to really strike at the heart of the Confederacy, and this is what is wanted here. I mean, this is a strategy that had been seen as early, you know, in the Revolutionary War as well, where, you know, free their slaves, they'll all come running to us, and it'll make this war end quickly. It's a similar tactic, but again, I believe that the pressure that is being brought to bear is because these African Americans themselves are making the choices to go in the Army. They are not sitting back and waiting for word. They are going into these camps, they're pressing these issues, and these commanding officers themselves are having to make these choices. Now, McClellan, He's an interesting sort. McClellan, before he even advances militarily, he likes to send out letters to the surrounding slaveholders to say, I'm not coming to take your property. But at the same time, you have, Fremont and Butler who are really strategizing about how to best use this new resource that has come into the mix. And again, I think that all of this is coming to bear and helping Lincoln make the important transition that he needs to make.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that regardless of how we get to this day and this document, the military, the battles, Lincoln's, starting to reconsider, rethink his long history of sort of his hatred of slavery. There are a couple of bottom lines. One is that when this document, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, essentially affirms what the slaves have been saying all along, that you can't win it without us. And Lincoln admits that he can't. He admits that this is a military document. And the second bottom line, I think, is that when we talk about the slaves moving and going into camp, it seems like, to use some of the terminology from the period, a flood of people, a swarm of people, which is very problematic in a lot of ways. But what we have to also remember is that black people in 1861 were not coming from nowhere. That they had a sense of politics, they had a politics. If we connect the long history of slavery to the Civil War, then we can better appreciate how they were able to make decisions about going to Union lines. Why should they go there? Why should they expect that this army that's coming everywhere with proclamations saying that we're not here for you, we are here to protect your master? Why should they trust these guys? And initially they don't. They sit back and they wait, they assess. But most importantly, they're not coming from nowhere. They have a long history of movement, of running away, of going to the north, of going to Canada. And those movements are not separated from the people who remain behind. There is communication back and forth. And so I would really like, one of the things I'd like to come out of this long, year-long discussion about the Emancipation Proclamation is that we go back and rethink what we think about the enslaved people, what we think about their decision to run away, to run to the Union lines, and also, as Ed knows, what happens once they are within those Union lines. It's not a pretty picture. Freedom is not freedom. It doesn't happen just because you end up in Union lines. It doesn't happen just because you make it from Maryland to D.C. It's a very long, protracted struggle, and that struggle doesn't start in 1861. It starts in 1619.
So,
Ed, can I build on one of Thavolia's points, and that is that this was a military statement that Lincoln is making with the proclamation. It's very deliberately so, because he is trying to keep the broadest spectrum of the white citizenry of the United States on board with this war. And the free states, then, it's hard for us even to imagine this, are overwhelmingly white. The 1860 census shows that 98.8% of the people who lived in the free states were white. Almost half of them are Democrats. They don't want to fight a war for emancipation. They are ardently against it. But Lincoln thinks the best way to present emancipation to that part of the population is as an essential tool, military tool, to defeat the Confederacy and save the Union. He thinks that's the best way to try to keep the broadest part of the northern white population on board.
So let's pause here briefly. Eric, tell us, what does this Emancipation Proclamation actually say?
What is it? Well, yes, on September 22nd,
5 days after Antietam,
Lincoln makes public this, what we call now, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. which had been sort of sitting in his desk for a couple of months, waiting for a military victory to take place so that when he issued it, it would not seem like an act of desperation. It is not the same as the final Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st in important ways. It basically declares that if, it doesn't free anybody on that day, it says that if the South, the Confederacy does not stop fighting within 100 days, that is by January 1st, at that point he will declare free, or quote unquote forever free, all the slaves in areas controlled by the Confederacy. It's a warning, it's a promise, but it's also a warning to the South that if the war goes on, I am going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. Now, it is military, but it's also political because Lincoln quotes the Second Confiscation Act, which had been passed by Congress, declaring slaves of rebels free if they got to Union lines. But this list document is a little different. It doesn't say it's areas of, in these areas of the South, everybody becomes free. Whether your owner is a rebel or a Union person makes no difference. So that is a significant change. It's no longer a punishment for rebellion. It is a military action to help undermine the Confederacy and win the war. But at this point, the document also includes things that include some of Lincoln's previous ideas. It says, again, I'm going to push for colonization. That is, we're going to try to encourage these freed people to leave the United States. And it also talks about compensation. He's still talking about paying owners for losing their property. In a way, that's to encourage slave owners to support this. Say, wait a minute, after January 1st, I may not get any money. If we agree now, well, I'll get compensated. So it shows Lincoln in this transitional moment. His views on slavery, or that is to say, his policies are changing. He's promising that as of January 1st, all the slaves in Confederate areas will become free, but he's still keeping in these incentives, colonization, compensation, to try to make emancipation more palatable both to Southerners and to the population, the parts of the population of the North that Gary mentioned who really don't want to fight a war for emancipation.
Because this is just weeks really before the fall elections. And so he's putting this out, you can imagine right now,
right?
Okay, where we are in relation to the elections and to do this. So what's the response to this document? Anybody? Or actually all of you?
Mixed.
Yes, mixed.
I need more.
Well, McClellan has a response, right?
Yes. McClellan had lectured Lincoln in the wake of the 7 days not to do anything like this. Very specifically, don't make this war about emancipation. McClellan didn't believe in forced emancipation. He believed in state action for emancipation. So I think a lot depends on whether you're a Republican or a Democrat in the United States. If you're a Confederate, let's just say your reaction isn't positive.
Not at all.
What do you accuse Lincoln of doing with this?
Inciting servile insurrection. This is the John Brown's raid nightmare writ extremely large with hundreds of thousands of United States soldiers moving around the landscape. So images like that would pop into mind. Images of Haiti would pop into mind. I mean, this really triggers some of the most profound fears on the part of white Southerners.
And white Northerners.
And white Northerners too.
Some people may feel that our political dialogue today is not at the elevated level it ought to be. But if you look at the political dialogue of 1862, and particularly the way Democrats in the North pick up on this and issue these lurid warnings about the massacre of whites in the South once slave becomes free, or they're all going to come up to the North and take white people's jobs and marry their daughters. The degree of absolutely overt racism in the fall campaign would be astonishing today to anyone, looking at what political language is acceptable and not acceptable nowadays. So there is a significant backlash in the North, as well as abolitionists and others saying this is great, this is what ought to be done. But when the fall elections come around, the Republicans suffer some pretty serious defeats in the North. Now, of course, all elections depend on many, many things, but a lot of people think that an adverse reaction to the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is at least partly responsible for Republican losses in these fall elections.
Christy, how about the abolitionists? What was their response?
It's split. It also is split. You have those who are saying, for example, the newspaper, The Anglo-African, that is saying, well, you know, this is a step in the right direction, and, you know, it's not everything that we hope for, but we need to hang in there. Frederick Douglass is furious. I mean, he is absolutely furious that Lincoln is trying to placate the Democratic interests, the Southern Democratic interests, the Northern Democratic interests, what have you. But most folks are in a wait and see and watch and see mode. A lot of the leading ministerial groups within the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, are actually taking a wait and see attitude, and they begin to have conversations amongst their congregants about the importance of these, what will become the watch parties. Let's you know, this is a good thing. Let's wait and see what happens come January 1, and we need to be prepared and ready ourselves to embrace our newly freed brethren. And so some of them are actually starting to send teachers into these areas in the South to try to begin this process of citizenship and what freedom is really going to mean. So again, you have this spectrum even among the abolitionists about what's happened here.
How about on the ground in the South, Thavolia? You know, the enslaved people, does this matter to them?
It does matter, and I think in part they must be laughing, even as they suffer, because their slaveholders are saying that this document will cause or lead to servile insurrection. Well, if you believe that black people are, you know, incapable of thought, incapable of or wanting to be free, how can you believe that they would rise up? And so white Southerners are caught like in a very difficult intellectual space. On the one hand, they have to assert that black people are happy being enslaved. And on the other hand, now they have to say, well, this will let them, wow, they'll go wild, they'll want freedom. So it's very interesting, but I also think that the aftermath of this, in the aftermath of this document, on the ground, people are still moving. They're not stopping to think about what the Democrats are doing in Washington. They're thinking about, okay, New Orleans is now free. The Union Navy is trying to get Vicksburg, and black people throughout the valley, the Mississippi Valley, are trying to move to Union lines. Grant and Sherman, they're skirmishing all over the place, and warfare all over the place. So you've got a as all wars are, kind of leveled here. On the one hand, there's Washington, and there's the politics in New York, and the Democrats all over the place, kind of trying to get Lincoln out of office. On the other hand, people on the ground are just still fighting for what they've been fighting for the last year and a half.
And so, I want to do two more things. Where, as you can see, time is hurtling forward. Let me ask you this. So, what's the world say about this? And then I want to get us from the preliminary to the Emancipation Proclamation. So what does the world say about this document?
Well, you know, American diplomats in Europe had been pressing Secretary of State Seward saying, you know, there is a lot of support for emancipation in Europe, and if you want to get other countries on your side, they don't care as much about the preservation of the American Union, whether there's one or two nations here, but they do care about the issue of slavery and emancipation. So I think it does have an effect in Britain, in France, in making it less likely that those countries might intervene on the side of the Confederacy or perhaps try to mediate a negotiated settlement in the war. It's not clear how much that particular consideration affected Lincoln's thinking, but I think overall the preliminary proclamation and then the final one had a positive effect on the sort of loyalties of people abroad in terms of the American conflict.
So basically, the answer right now is that nothing really happened, right? But what could have happened is that the Confederacy could have been recognized as an...
It could have been.
And in fact, on the day of the Battle of Antietam, on the 17th, the two key actors in London, Viscount Palmerston, who was the Prime Minister, and Lord John Russell, who was the Foreign Secretary, the equivalent of our Secretary of State, exchanged notes in which they said that if Lee's army won another victory, having won 2 at the 7 days and Second Bull Run, that London should try to mediate an end to the conflict. So this is before the preliminary proclamation. And the proclamation, as Eric said, certainly on balance helped to a degree, but it would not by itself have brought any, I think, decisive action on the part of the Europeans.
And as hard as it is for us to imagine, people at the time thought, well, if the South separates, then we'll work with them to bring slavery to an end later on. You know, so and people in Europe are saying.
There are those who thought that would happen. I think as historians looking back from the moment, jumping out of our September 1862, I think it's most likely that slavery would have lasted a long time if the Confederacy had won its independence. Would slavery exist today? No, I doubt it. But it would not have ended in the 1860s. I think one could be pretty confident about that.
I think we would have been last. We would have been
after
Brazil and Cuba.
Yeah. Turn of the century, early 20, who knows? And it would have been probably replaced by something even more oppressive than the actual situation that developed in the South in the late 19th century.
One more point on the Europeans, really quickly, and that is that the French were busy trying to establish their control over Mexico. They had a 35,000-man army there, a puppet regime there, and the Confederacy was perfectly willing to acknowledge French control in Mexico in return for French acknowledgement of Confederate sovereignty. And so the French had a reason to look the other way about emancipation.
So whether you look on the ground at the individual decisions of enslaved people or militarily or politically in the North or the South or internationally, things are not really settled 150 years ago today. What leads Lincoln to issue what we now know as the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, and how does it change and what does it tell us about the course of the war? Go.
You know, the final Emancipation Proclamation, which is what Lincoln warned or promised he would do 100 days earlier, I think it transforms the Civil War. It makes the war both officially, not simply unofficially on the ground, but officially a war not simply to preserve the nation, but to end the institution of slavery, the most important institution of Southern life, the greatest concentration of property in the United States, an economic institution which affected the entire nation, not just the South. And I can only quote Karl Marx, who was writing in London at that time for the New York Tribune, and in his article about the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which applies even more to he said, "We have up to now seen the constitutional waging of war. We are now going to see the revolutionary waging of war." In other words, the war becomes a war to completely overturn Southern society as it had existed before. And that has implications nobody can foresee in 1862 or 1863, and we're still living in some ways with the implications of that transformation.
But everybody understands that everything is on the table now,
right,
from a Confederate perspective, everything. And it isn't just slaveholders who have a stake in slavery. In the slaveholding states, all white people have a stake in slavery because it gives them control, social control over millions of African Americans. Robert E. Lee is generally considered a moderate on slavery. He was actually very conventional in his views about slavery for someone from his class. He wrote a letter just a few days after the Emancipation Proclamation it's just, you can tell that he's beside himself with anger at this proclamation, that it threatens the entire social structure of the Confederacy and could lead to, as he put it, degradation. He uses all the buzzwords that antebellum white Southerners used when they talked about what might happen if they lost control over black people.
I'd just like to add that Lincoln also made it clear that black people would also have to effect their own actual emancipation. And those were the words he used, their own actual emancipation. What I write down here, this policy says, I'm behind you. And my armies are not supposed to hinder you. They're no longer to stop you. They should help you. But his armies couldn't do that. His armies had wars, battles to fight. Sherman had to get from Tennessee to Atlanta and then to Savannah and then to Columbia. actual emancipation was what the slaves had to do for themselves, despite or in spite of the Emancipation Proclamation.
So, in summary, what should we think about the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation? Is this a turning point? Is it a promise unfulfilled? Is it the beginning of the end? I'd ask each of you just to give us how you would crystallize it.
I think just in one second, it is a turning point in a long process that involved many people. It involved slaves, it involved the Army, it involved Lincoln, it involved Congress, abolitionists. No one person or one moment is responsible for the end of slavery.